Got a great crew, Melanie. Why don't we give it another minute?
Hi, Vicki.
So low mad people, you want to turn your videos off, please? Shannon, Jillian.
I think we were going to sing first. I think that's maybe why they have them on. Not to ruin the surprise, but I just wanted to let you know.
No, that's the definition of ruining a surprise.
Yeah, you ruined it.
That's why I did it so quickly, but I was like, I'll just put it back on when everyone else does.
I turned everybody's video off.
Definitely ruined the surprise.
I'm sorry.
Melanie, it was your idea.
It was your idea, Melanie.
How'd you make a surprise and then
I'm horrible at keeping surprises to myself.
clearly.
Also, sorry, don't put the cats back in the bag.
When I buy the kids Christmas gifts, it bugs me not to tell them. I'm horrible at keeping secrets like that.
Me too. Okay. It's a joke. Cameron's like, oh, what am I getting for Christmas? She'll just ask me because she knows I can't do it.
Okay. Melanie, I asked everybody to restart their video. I'm making you host us again.
In my defense, I had to get the birthday hat. So that is why I figured it was a necessary component.
We should probably get started so that everybody else understands what this brouhaha is all about.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is Melanie Daly. I am doing today's presentation, but before we start, we wanted to wish our fearless leader a happy birthday, and if we could all sing happy birthday, start the presentation.
This is being recorded. I just want you to know. Leah Zakari may have this on her next CD that she releases.
All right, guys. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you.
Happy
birthday
to
you.
Happy
birthday, dear
birthday.
Happy birthday to you.
Yay!
Oh my God, that was awful.
That was incredibly awful.
Come on, Najee, you got the voice. Do
I'm
it.
not sure if I'm having a birthday or if I died.
It did sort of sound like a dirge for a little bit there, didn't it?
Sound like a dirge.
James, I feel like you really set the tone of it being very slow.
Yes.
Yeah, we gotta get that up.
Because the voice it just overpowered everyone else's, so he made it very slow.
Oh gosh, that better not be posted anywhere.
Oh, it'll be on the website. Well done, everybody. Why don't we get started with a really good song instead of that one?
Okay.
Oh, it's not playing.
Oh no.
We're not even gonna get to hear the good song. All right,
Yeah.
Melanie, I would say we're having a technical issue with the playing of the song, but I can still hear you. So why don't we get started on the
Okay.
actual presentation?
It's playing on mine. That's weird. Okay. So you don't hear it now either?
No, I do not. No, I do not.
Okay. Okay, we will start. My name is Melanie Daly. Like I said, I am going to do a presentation today on the medical treatment guidelines for major depressive disorder. These guidelines will be new as of January 21st, January 1st, 2021. And we will go through them.
And I'm Melanie's friend. I'm Melissa.
Yes, I'm sorry. Melissa is my friend.
Yes. Our show is called Lawyers and Friends, and today I'm playing the part of a friend.
Yes. Can you hear it? Okay. Here we are. Happy birthday. This is supposed to be on for Melissa's birthday today. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend, and I hope you have fun stuff planned.
It's been great so far.
Okay, so the purpose of the medical treatment guidelines for depressive disorder was to provide a greater clarity for providers and for injured workers to reflect the most effective and modern treatment techniques for depression, which can be diagnosed as directly related to the job, which we will get into later, or consequential, something that develops after the initial injury. An alternative was to just maintain the medical treatment guidelines as they were, but the board recognized that the lack of clarity with major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, which Cassie went over last month, was not very clear, so they wanted to provide more clarity to the situation. Yes?
Sorry. Just to clarify, right now the guidelines have not been finalized yet, right?
Correct.
Okay.
They
So
have not been finalized, and it's up for public comment, and there are a few bits you can tell when you go through that are missing. So we will see what the actual final guidelines come up with.
yeah, it actually, the guidelines, the published draft is it looks like homework that hasn't been finished yet. Like a student submitted a homework assignment, and it's just like, I'm going to get to this later because they're very unfinished.
Yes, yes.
So we still have another 30 days for public comment period, and I kind of got the sense that the board was looking for a lot of assistance from the public and helping to finalize the draft of the guidelines. So if you have recommendations for what the board should be looking for, I would encourage you to go and make some comments.
Okay. Okay, so as an introduction, the essential feature of major depressive disorder is an episode of a period of at least 2 weeks, which is either depressed mood or the loss of interest in activities that the individual once had pleasure to doing. The diagnosis can be based on a single episode, but it's typically recurring. It involves multiple symptoms of depression that persist and significantly interfere with the normal activities of the individual, to include social activities, occupational activities, which is obviously more relevant in our case, and basically their ability to function in an everyday capacity. Also, we will get to the diagnostic criteria of it, but other symptoms include the depressed mood, reduced interest, weight changes, sleep disturbances, fatigue, reduced ability to think, and of course, suicidal thoughts or attempts may occur also. So to diagnose somebody, a claimant with depression, it would start out with a clinical interview, which basically the treating provider would go through an interview of the claimant's history, anything that they may be experiencing in their life, such as divorce, any financial issues, the typical things that would cause depression in an individual. And they also do a complete blood workup to determine if there's any other reason physiologically that the individual may experience depressive symptoms, such as hormonal imbalances, thyroid stimulating hormone, pregnancy screening or toxicology. So if they could rule out that it would be a physiological issue, then remedy that, then maybe a diagnosis would not be reached of depression. Also, they use, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The criteria for the evaluation that the medical provider does in order to reach a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, were those laid out with specificity in the proposed medical treatment guidelines for MDD?
Not really. I mean, they provided the DSM criteria, but they didn't actually give an actual more detail on the clinical interview. And I did find case law that referenced objective tests, but I don't see anything really that objective in these guidelines.
Yeah, it was very surprising to me because when you look at the guidelines for non-acute pain, they're very specific with respect to the interview that the provider should conduct as part of the psychosocial evaluation of the patient, and considering that component and its potential contribution to non-acute pain. The level of detail in that evaluation compared to the absolute lack of any real guidance in these proposed guidelines for performing the evaluation, although the guidelines seem to reiterate how important that evaluation is and that a diagnosis shouldn't be made on. I don't want to steal your thunder on that, but I was very surprised at the lack of specificity that these guidelines have, because that's what I'm always looking for with the medical treatment guidelines, are specific requirements with respect to any process, any part of the process, because then that gives us the ammunition if we need to challenge treatment or diagnosis. That's what gives us the best ammunition for challenging those things.
Yes, I agree. We'll get to the PHQ, but there is just, that small questionnaire that I just can't even believe that would be something that would have any basis on it. So the DSM-5, which was established in 2013, the criterion for A is you have to have at least 5 of these, and at least one of them has to be depressed mood and markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities.
And Melanie, this is looking for clarification. My understanding with the DSM-5 is that all 5 of the criteria that are listed in the DSM-5 are needed in order to reach the diagnosis of MDD. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the first of those.
Yes. So, and that's another thing is, it has to be at least 5 of them. But if you have, let's say, the significant weight change, the sleep, psychomotor agitation, fatigue, or guilty feelings, that doesn't count, because you have to have at least depressed mood or markedly diminished interest.
Right. I guess to clarify, within the DSM-5, there are criteria. There's criteria A, criteria B, criteria C, criteria D, and criteria E, and all 5 of those criteria need to be present. And then within criteria A, you also have to have these five of these features with at least one of the first 2 of these symptoms before you can reach the diagnosis. Is that do I have it right? Okay.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So this is the first of 5 general categories that have to be present to make the diagnosis of MDD. And within the first of these criteria A, you have to have 5 of these criteria, and at least you have to have one of either depressed mood or markedly diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities.
And this is really the only objective, observable by others thing that I've seen in these guidelines, the psychomotor agitation, which, that I don't know exactly what they're referring to other than just, being agitated, but the rest is pretty much subjective. And I think,
I went through and I checked off the 5 that I figured I would see on every report where a provider diagnosed MDD, because for exactly the reason that you're saying, like, we're never going to see psychomotor agitation nearly every day observable by another as one of the 5 in the criteria A in order to make the diagnosis of MDD, because where are you going to get that information from? We're going to get and I think weight change, that's also a very objective criteria that, if you're not losing or gaining 5% of your overall body weight, which is unusual. That would be highly unusual. Within a month, I think, is what the guidelines say. So I find that is unlikely to be one of the criteria that we're going to, that the providers will use in order to reach the MDD. But the guilty feelings, the diminished concentration, the insomnia, the loss of pleasure in most activities, those are the ones that are subjective and we'll see.
Okay, and then B, the symptoms significantly distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So, you know, there was one case that we'll get to later, but she was having diagnosed depressive symptoms, but since it was not impeding her ability to work, it was not established, which I thought was interesting. But it actually has to have a severe impact on your life. You can't, you know, just say that you're feeling depressed, but to what extent, and it would have to obviously diminish your ability to function. The criterion C is episode is not attributable to physiological effects of substance or another medical condition, which, as we previously discussed, that's where the blood work would come into play if there's any sort of hormonal imbalance, such as thyroid or blood work that provides another physiological indication that may be causing the depressive feelings. And then criterion D, the occurrence is also not better explained by some other mental illness that is within the DSM-5, such as schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, schizophreniform disorder, delusional disorder, or any other thing that could be diagnosed under a different section of the manual. And also criterion E is never a manic or hypomanic, which obviously sounds like it's ruling out bipolar, which can have depressive episodes, but would not necessarily mean that it would be a depressive diagnosis.
So to me, these the DSM-5 criterion that were listed in the guidelines and the specificity with which what they identified what's required in order to make the MDD diagnosis, this is going to be powerful tools for us in challenging the sufficiency of medical evidence to proceed even on whether or not somebody has a consequential major depressive disorder.
Exactly. And then, like I said before, the DSM-5, they were established in 2013. Prior to that, it was the DSM-4. And they have, you know, different, if the claimant is diagnosed with depression prior to the establishment of the DSM-5, then you may use the criterion for the DSM-5 to continue that diagnosis. If they were diagnosed with the criterion of the DSM-5, then they have to maintain that criteria. And so in summary, an injured worker that has a prior diagnosis of major depressive disorder under DSM-4 maintains the diagnosis and should be treated within accordance to these guidelines.
So my understanding in reading that part of the retroactive application or the bright line test of when you apply DSM-5 versus DSM-4 was that the date of publication of the DSM-5 was the bright line date for whether or not the MDD diagnosis could be made pursuant to DSM-4 or DSM-5. And that date was May 18th of 2013, like you've referenced. But regardless of whether or not the MDD diagnosis was made pursuant to 4 or pursuant to 5, these guidelines apply.
Yes.
So that's, I mean, I guess except with respect to diagnosis. So even though you may have a diagnosis pursuant to the DSM-4, because the diagnosis occurred prior to 5/18/13, you still would be governed by the treatment recommendations in these guidelines once they're finalized.
And actually, it's an interesting side point. I just, I looked up to see if there was a DSM-6 coming because I was surprised at how long it had been since they updated it. And it looked like they are not going to come out with a 6, which
My
I found
recollection is that it took forever to get the group of medical providers who use the DSM diagnostic criteria to even agree that they should switch to 5. So I'm not surprised that there would be resistance to that.
Okay, and so the overview of screening and monitoring. Oh, here we are. So this is the survey that I was discussing, that we were discussing before, the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. This is basically the baseline of screening for major depressive disorder, which A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and that's about it. You have severity to from 0 to 3. And I know it's kind of hard to read on this one, so I'll go to the next one where you can basically, you get the score: little interest in doing things, feeling down, depressed, hopeless, feeling tired, little energy, trouble concentrating, poor appetite or overeating, moving or speaking slowly, or thoughts of self-harm.
Did you take, did you like check them off as you were going through them while you were reading them? Because I did.
Yes, yes. And most of it was due to parenting. So, no, I shouldn't say that, but.
Yeah, I think recently because of the new orange status in our neck of the woods,
Oh, yes.
I got a little verklempt the other day, but I'm feeling better now.
I know this. It's just, I feel like it's just such a small, they don't give us anything more about the clinical interview other than they mention it. And then they concentrate so much on this little survey,
screen tool.
Which, so I just thought that was interesting. So basically, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And I always just kind of question the honesty of the respondents. You know, I mean, this tool is like, if you're really depressed, you don't want somebody to, I guess, ask you about it or to possibly give you assistance with it, because you're so depressed, you just want to isolate and you just don't want people to know. So you're going to say like, yeah, no, I'm fine. So,
right. I mean, I was thinking as I was reading this, was those surveys where sometimes if you've applied for a job where they ask you the same questions but in different ways.
Yeah,
I feel like that would be more efficient than this. But
I do have those tests that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later, the more intensive, like psychiatric or psychological tests rather, like the MMPI and those types of things that psychologists are very territorial about. They they all have their way of interpreting, I think, those results. But yeah, those tests can also be used, and I'm sure you'll get to that in a bit.
Okay, so this is hard to see, but basically the total score is minimal, mild, moderate, moderately severe, or severe. So, and they also discuss that this is not necessary if there's a obvious clinical diagnosis, that the doctor can actually, you know, talk to the patient and decide based on their interaction with them that they are suffering from major depressive disorder. So basically the treatment overview initially is cognitive behavioral therapy, which they demonstrate that a 12 to 16 week program is usually effective in mild to moderate depression, and also can be used in combination with the antidepressants. So that's indicated when you've tried one and it hasn't worked by itself, and then you would try both of them. So there are different types of the behavioral therapy or psychological counseling that we'll get to later. But it seems like as a first line of treatment, the 12 to 16 week course is pretty comparable to the antidepressant for mild to moderate.
So you don't jump right into the antidepressant. In fact, the guidelines seem to suggest that people should be trying CBT more frequently than they do.
Yes, and yeah, I know I did read in these guidelines that some of the restrictions to it is that it's hard to find the therapists that actually do that or are available to do that.
That's probably because we give them such a hard time about getting their bills paid when they do try and treat comp claimants. Maybe that will improve.
And also, like I said, it may significantly improve treatment outcomes when used in combination. So these are the 3 screening tools, the PHQ that we just discussed and went over, and the psychometric testing. That is basically testing for any other sort of mental illness or mental issue that may be diagnosed somewhere else in the manual. So if it's anxiety or bipolar or anything else that could, you know, have caused, then the treatment provider would lead the claimant to the correct avenue of treatment. And they do mention the PHQ-9 that is benefits because it is available and understood cross-culturally, so it can be pretty much used anywhere, and the administration of it is pretty easy, and it's able to recognize a change in symptoms, which I'm not sure if I would entirely agree with that, but all right. And then they do discuss the clinical correlation is required, but in these screening tools may help in suggesting that there's a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, but the clinical correlation is required.
And again, the clinical correlation, that's kind of where we have this sort of, black hole really of guidance, I think, on compared to the non-acute pain guidelines with respect to what the psychosocial evaluation of the patient should be. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not a lot more detail is forthcoming when they finalize the rule or when they finalize the guidelines.
Okay. And then the pharmacogenomics testing, I keep having trouble with that one. Basically, they're testing how your body metabolizes the medications. They mentioned the CYP2D6 and CYP2C19, which I had to look up, but they're the liver enzymes. So if you're prescribed a medication and either you're suffering from side effects from it, or if it's not as effective, there's probably something physiologically that is not allowing your body to process it as well as it's intended to be. So
yeah, I'd never even heard of that kind of testing or seen that kind of testing done in any of the medical reports that I've reviewed over the 20 plus years that I've been doing this. But this might be something somewhat new.
Okay, and then further on the treatment options. So the psychological interventions, that includes the cognitive behavioral therapy, as we touched on, the 12 to 16 course of weekly individual CBT, and this is where we're missing something, evidence for the use of CBT, and then that's the end of that. So we're not really sure what they're depending on.
So each one of these different kinds of interventions that the guidelines identify at the end suggests evidence for the use of blah, 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 the screening tool, or for cognitive behavioral therapy, or for ECT, which like knocked me out of my chair, electroconvulsive therapy.
Yes.
So anyway, each section ends with evidence for the use of, or the diagnosis of, and so that's why you can really kind of tell that these guidelines seem to be sort of a work in progress, that there's definitely additional information that's going to be coming.
And another example of psychological intervention is the acceptance and commitment therapy, which basically the key feature is acceptance rather than avoidance of the emotional pain. So if an individual who is depressed, they're trying to avoid their pain, so a lot of them may just stay in bed or they lose their interest in their activities. So this is actually having the patient recognize their feelings and accepting them and learning how to cope with them.
And one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind is that these guidelines, like all the guidelines, start out with the general principles that apply to the medical treatment guidelines, which are that the treatment of the injured worker is meant to restore functional ability, and that there's an active role for the injured employee to play in managing their own treatment and their symptoms. So I noticed that theme. So this acceptance and commitment therapy, I would say again, that it would be important for the claimant to demonstrate that they are an active participant in their own recovery and in the treatment process. And a lack of that would, I guess, lead to a conclusion that the efficacy of that type of treatment is absent, and so therefore you shouldn't have to continue to pay for it. Or if there are 12 years worth of CBT visits by a psychologist and the patient is still depressed and still has no functional ability and is still 100% disabled, well, it doesn't really sound like the treatment's working very well, and it's not restoring the individual's functional abilities if after 12 years of treatment they're still unable to work.
And it has to be I mean, aside from the timeline that you just discussed, some sort of, you know, who's paying attention to how well they're actually doing. Because of course the treating provider is going to say, oh, they're in treatment and they're doing great. And then, but they're still not ready to go back to work. So it's kind of, you know, and then you have the IME that will examine them for a day and give a different opinion. But then, of course, they always rely on the treating who's been treating them consistently, so would know better.
Right. So you take that PHQ, and if the person's been seeing a psychologist for 12 weeks and they've been using behavioral therapy with the individual, and the PHQ values after the 12th week are the same or similar to the PHQ values from the first treatment that was provided, then I think you have a strong argument that there's no value to this type of treatment for the individual. And, you know, not that they don't deserve treatment, but we need to move on and try something else.
Right.
Maybe a little ECT.
And then the behavioral therapy, basically this is kind of like a reward system for the individual to associate their social activities or interests that they used to enjoy, and making an effort to schedule these activities and associate those activities with the good feelings. So, you know, I'm sure that it works, and, you know, that's good, but it's kind of, it seems that it would not really be an objective measurement either. If somebody, basically you're just saying, do what you used to like to do, and, you know, once they enjoy it, then it's still, how do you decide whether or not they should continue that treatment? Interpersonal psychotherapy is also a form of psychological intervention, which basically focusing on the individuals and the relationships of people in their life by targeting 4 primary areas: interpersonal loss, role conflict, role change, and interpersonal skills. So, and then the mindfulness based cognitive therapy is for individuals with depression, which they do experiential exercises and other techniques to aid them in experiencing effect without necessarily attempting to change it. So with regard to their thoughts, unlike the actual cognitive therapy, this does not do so much to seek to modify or eliminate the dysfunctional thoughts, but to become more detached, and able to observe them as objects. So this is basically all it would be dealing individually with a psychologist.
Just a little anecdote here. I had a claimant once who, this is not the same type of treatment, but he had post-concussive syndrome, which we know is a very difficult condition when it appears in our claims for us to be able to refute. But his provider had wanted him to keep a headache journal because he had headaches allegedly as part of his post-concussive syndrome. And he showed up over and over and over again without having completed his headache journal. And ultimately we were able to fight and get the treatment for the post-concussive CBT that he was undergoing disallowed because he was not compliant with the treatment. So to the extent that a lot of these treatment modalities would require active participation by the individual, I think that we would be within our rights to require the psychologist or the provider to document the active efforts that the claimant is taking in order, you know, to be part of, you know, the solution to the problems that they're facing, the symptoms that they're having.
Yes, definitely. And because, yeah, it would be easy for them to just say, oh, you know, I'm doing it, and then they could just easily manipulate that. All right. And
really, the stuff works too. I mean, like, that's the point, right? I mean, you know, that behavioral therapy, that behavioral activation, I've always thought that the antidote to depression is action. And so, you know, getting people back and doing things, like whether it's something they enjoy or working. I mean, that's why I think that it's well known, I think, you know, just sort of accepted in our community that if somebody doesn't return to work within the first 6 months after an accident, the likelihood that they're going to return to work ever drops precipitously. And I think that a lot of that has to do with probably people get depressed, and they get there's a certain sense of inertia with you know, not being able to do the things that you used to be able to do, or at least believing that you can't do those things anymore. You know, I mean, I actually really believe too that the active participation by the injured worker in this treatment, by really taking the suggestions of their providers to heart and really making an effort to do them, is going to help them recover and hopefully ultimately return back to work.
Yes, I believe we had a claim recently where he was suggesting that, because I think he was thinking that she might be becoming depressed because she hadn't been back to work yet, and he was suggesting this type of psychological evaluation or psychological treatment to get her back in the mindset that she would want to go back to work.
Yeah, I thought that the guidelines did envision that too, that the MDD, that the evaluations, it's not necessarily just solely to provide a diagnosis and treatment for a diagnosis of MDD, but also to provide some early interventions to assist people in avoiding becoming depressed as a result of an occupational injury. So you perform those screenings before they actually, you know, hit an episode, a full-blown episode of major depressive disorder. You know, again, we might be able to avoid some of these more negative outcomes that we get with people who lose hope and the ability to cope when they've been out of work and unable to do the things that they used to do for long periods of time.
And it should really probably be a requirement for, I mean, especially for severe injuries, for the treating providers to actually ask them about how are you feeling mentally, are you feeling, you know, and just start asking them those questions. So then to be better equipped and to, you know, refer them to somebody.
And in fact, that is part of our our guiding principles for the medical treatment guidelines, is that the individual, they've definitely expanded on these since the original guidelines were promulgated, whenever that was, back in 2012, I think. But they talk about delayed recovery, and for those who have failed to make expected progress 6 to 12 weeks after an injury, then you really should be looking for psychosocial or psychological reasons for why it is that the individual isn't recovering. So, you know, we can be aware of and wary of claims. You know, we know where our problem claims are going to come, but claims where people are not recovering to the extent that they should be, and to have our providers start to, I guess, become more aggressive in describing the individual as not making expected progress when we're looking at those initial reports and things are starting to go south with respect to the individual's expected recovery.
Yeah. And then the last one is it's a brief psychodynamic, short-term psychodynamic psychotherapy, first line of treatment, often used in addition to the antidepressants. For severe depressive disorders, is used as an adjunctive to medication.
Is this a new slide, Melanie, or is this still?
No, this was should have been on this slide, but it was in the guidelines. It's right under the treatment.
Okay.
So it's just another, instead of starting at the 12 to 16 weeks, it sounds like it's basically the same principles as the rest of them, but it's just starting at the 8-week interval.
Got ya.
Okay, antidepressants. I just realized there's a typing error.
I just saw it.
There are 4 major classes: this selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, tricyclic antidepressants, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. I'm not entirely sure if I'm pronouncing all of those correctly, but basically those, you know, are more along the lines of a psychiatrist who is going to be diagnosing the individual and prescribing them to them based on any contraindications of any other medications that they're on. Similar to the weaning of opioid medication that we see when we're discussing it, to taper off of these, it has to be supervised, and it should be in a slow, steady, you know, plan to do so. Otherwise, the risk of relapse is higher. For all SSRIs, they may be used in the first line of treatment in adults. The selection of an antidepressant is typically dependent on several factors, including concomitant symptoms to potentially address simultaneously, like sleep disturbance. So if somebody is having trouble maintaining sleep, they may also be prescribed something to help them sleep. Anticipated potential for adverse effects, prior adverse effects, or comorbid psychiatric medical illnesses. So obviously that would involve more of knowing which of these medications are not good with the others. And providers should ensure that an appropriate dose, titration, and target dose range has been achieved and an adequate trial period allowed.
So I think what's important to know about the antidepressants and about the CBT therapy is that both are first-line treatments, and there's really no indication for both treatments concomitantly unless there is evidence of a complicated depressive condition or a more than moderate depressive condition. So I think the guidelines really suggest that you should be doing one or the other, not both, as a first-line treatment, unless there's some evidence that the depression is the major depressive disorder is something beyond ordinary. Perhaps somebody with that comes to the workplace with significant prior trauma. Psychic trauma, either from military service or from abuse as a child or something along those lines, or for somebody whose depression is characterized as, to a greater degree than simply mild to moderate.
Yes, and I do know that they reference back to the PHQ. So if it's like above 20, I believe, is the severity of it. So. And then, they determine if they did try one or the other and they didn't work, then they would combine the two.
Then you could try both, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And then they have antipsychotics also is for augmentation of antidepressants, which is a second generation antipsychotic should be considered only when other strategies have failed because they have significant side effects. Treatment of depressive disorders with psychotic characteristics include serious delusions, visual or auditory hallucinations, confusion, catatonic behavior, extreme negativism, peculiar movements, inappropriate effect of a bizarre or odd quality, or severe symptoms. But it sounds like that is the last line, last case that they would want to try because of the severe side effects that could occur.
Right, and it also seems as though some of the symptoms that those medications would be targeted at addressing would take the diagnosis outside of the DSM-5 because DSM-5 requires that there not be any prior manic periods or any schizophrenic or schizoactive, I think was the terms that were used in the DSM-5. Of course, this is a layperson kind of trying to interpret that stuff, but I would be on the lookout for, because people who have schizophrenia or who have bipolar disease or manic depression, there's believe that it seems less likely that that would have an occupational origin than an MDD kind of disorder.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of surprised to see, those symptoms in this area of the guidelines, because it said in the beginning that if it is attributed to that, then it would not be appropriate diagnosis for MDD. And then the electroconvulsive therapy, I tried to Google a photo to stick in here. This is probably one of the most benign ones that are on there. Some of them are a little creepy. But these are for patients with resistant major depressive disorder and included with the following conditions: catatonia, psychotic depression, severe suicidality, history of a good response to electroconvulsive therapy, and a need for rapid definitive treatment response in either medical or psychiatric grounds. And I don't know how often this is conducted, but it just seems, I don't know. I'm not really sure how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think ECT therapy was very commonly used up until the 80s, and then it experienced a period of decline in use because it was interpreted as being is not having the scientific backup to demonstrate its efficacy. But I think it's had a resurgence in popularity of treatment, because there actually is now correlation between improvement in depressive disorders with people who have an electroconvulsive therapy. And it's a lot different than the way it was done, back in the 50s and the 60s.
Right. That's what
Those
I
are
pictured.
probably the pictures you saw. But I guess it is supposed to be highly effective with, really intransigent major depressive disorders that are recalcitrant to other kinds of treatment. So it shouldn't automatically be discounted as a possibility for somebody, I don't think, although I have no idea what the fee schedule is and how much that kind of therapy would cost. We used to live by power lines, and we just figured like we were kind of getting ECT therapy for free.
Okay, and then finally, adjunctive therapies, including which would be used in combination of the psychotherapy and possibly antidepressants, exercise, which may be used in as a first-line therapy in combination with such as CBT or medication, aerobic exercise based on clinical assessment, improvement in depressive symptoms. So obviously, we all know exercising releases the endorphins. So but
this is a double-edged sword. So again, I'm like harping on a theme here, I guess, but I've been trying to emphasize, responsibility of the patient, of the injured worker, and taking responsibility and being an active participant in their therapy. But now I'm gonna, people who are diagnosed as depressed, we're gonna be paying for their gym memberships or paying for them.
Exactly, I was thinking about
for
that.
Their Pelotons or something in their home. So. I can't imagine why yoga, my husband says, is just basically stretching, which I don't really know because I've never done yoga. So I know people who do it really swear by it.
Yeah.
But hopefully we'd be able to find cost-effective ways to encourage people to participate in these kinds of activities as part of their treatment if they do have.
Yes, I was thinking just that. I said we're going to start getting bills for the gym memberships.
Yeah. Yeah,
and same with the yoga. I mean, I know you can do it by yourself, but if you actually enroll in a yoga class, I'm pretty sure it's not cheap. And that's also improvement in depressive symptoms, increased physical function, and overall well-being. And lastly, acupuncture, which is not recommended, but it, as we say, they're unfinished. We don't really know why. It doesn't really specify why, but not recommended for treatment of patients with depressive
disorders. It was weird that they carved out like that one thing for what is not recommended, but yeah, I did see that. And the whole guidelines just sort of have an unfinished feel to them, although they're 883 pages.
I know. I know. I mean, I was going through, and a lot of this is just the reference, but
yeah, there's a lot of citations, a lot of medical treatises, and actually there was a lot on medications too, and these studies, I guess, that prove the efficacy of certain medications.
Okay, so I did do a little case law research. I didn't find as much as I was hoping to, but as far as causal relationship to work-related stress, to establish a claim, the mental injuries caused by work-related stress are compensable if the claimant can establish that the stress that caused the injury was greater than that which other similarly situated workers experienced in the normal work environment.
And we could do an entire presentation just on those cases and the various components of that test for establishing a mental-only injury as a result of work-related stress. So it's definitely a challenge to wrap your hands around, basically mental conditions that people allege. And they're they tend to be very contentious because essentially the injured worker saying that work was so bad, it was such a horrible place to be, I developed this anxiety condition.
Right, right. I'm sure that maybe a lot of, I haven't seen that many, but that come from corrections based on maybe, but I'm sure that they're not exposed to anything different than the rest of them. So
right, but there is that there was a change to the statute which allows first line responders like police officers, firefighters, EMTs who now experience psychic trauma, who have mental injuries as a result of the psychic trauma to which they can be exposed, during their jobs. They are no longer required to show that the stress to which they're exposed is different from those similarly situated, because they routinely had those claims disallowed because, you know, somebody who works on a part of an ambulance crew or a police officer or a firefighter, that's part of their job, you know, to respond to potentially very horrific incidents. That's no longer an impediment to first responders, that they show that the stress that they've encountered is different from those who are similarly situated.
Okay, and I did find the Harvard Maintenance is the employer. It was disallowed because the depression was based on subjective complaints only. The claimant reported sleeplessness, fatigue, lethargy, the self-inventory, which I'm presuming is the PHQ possibly, included depressed mood, sleep disturbances, and changes in appetite.
That's a great case.
Yeah.
Was it it was a consequential claim?
Yes.
Super.
And I was hoping that they would give us a little more objective evidence, but there was really nothing. None of them really elaborated on what objective evidence they would consider.
You know, having it be more general allows you to use it in less facts. You know, you can use it then in factual situations. So
yes,
it's a great case. Good job.
And one more was the matter of Goose v. Jewelers. The treating doctor's opinion. I thought this was a little interesting. The treatment was remote in time, so the psychologist didn't really ask the claimant didn't know very much about the actual injury. And it was many years after the actual injury. He didn't ask her any questions about what happened, how much, pain she was experiencing, how it affected her life. He also had no information of the circumstances or the nature of injury, and he was also unaware of her social history. So the court actually decided that she had recently gone through a divorce. She was having maybe financial difficulties, and they decided, since he had no information on her daily activities or personal life history, her diagnosis was based on subjective complaints only and not in consideration of the whole picture of her life. So individuals who are claiming depression, it would be, important to see how much the psychologist actually asked what else is going on in your life that could possibly be attributing to
pandemic by any chance?
Right, exactly. So instead of just having the claimant come and say, oh, I got hurt and now I'm depressed, which seems what happened in this case, the court expected him to get a bigger picture of her actual daily activities and life and social circumstances. So the IME opinion explained that the claimant was exhibiting some symptoms of depression, but there were no psychiatric restrictions on her ability to perform her job. And there were also significant inconsistencies in her responses, which I'm sure that we would see a lot of. But that's a good case also, that they're actually saying, okay, so yes, you have depressive symptoms, but is it really an impediment to your ability to work? Which in this case, it was not. So
that is a great case, and that's an appellate division case.
Yes.
So that's great.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions?
We just need to, let me just unmute everybody. Okay, so everybody's microphone should be unmuted, unless you've muted your own microphone, in which case you're going to have to unmute yourself. But we are open to questions if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. This always happens. You can hear somebody who's like, multitasking right now. All right. Well, so since we don't have any questions verbally, then we are always available to answer your questions by email. So feel free to email myself at mday@madwcdefense.com or mdaly, M-D-A-L-Y, for Melanie at madwcdefense.com. That it is true that we are both MADs. We are both M-A-D.
Really try to take.
That is the reason why Melanie got an interview here, but it is definitely not the reason that she got the job. Has done a terrific job on this presentation, and she's doing a great job for us too, and helping us with our claims. So
Thank you.
Great job. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for somebody is desperately trying to get in touch with me apparently to wish me a happy birthday, or there's some sort of legal emergency. I'm believing the former, not the latter. But to have a great Thanksgiving holiday for everybody. Hopefully a safe and socially distanced holiday, and stay tuned for our December presentation, which I'm not sure if we have any MTGs left to cover that will be effective on January 21st. But if not, we will do a year-end special kind of webinar, and then always a popular one in January is James Cousins' survey of the important appellate division case law from the year. So that will be upcoming as well.
Just a side note, I just noticed Daniel's comment that Carrie Fisher had ECT every 3 to 6 months, and they sedate you and you are not awake. And the only muscles that spasm are your toes. So thank you, Daniel, for that nugget of information.
Happy birthday, Melissa.
That's great. Oh,
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
So I appreciate it. All right, everybody. So we will see you next month, and thanks again for tuning in.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.